a look at the Sunday papers now. We're joined this morning by the Europe editor of the Sunday Times, Peter Conradi, who's also the author of Who Lost Russia? From the Collapse of the USSR to Putin's War on Ukraine, and Samantha de Benden, Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and Russia expert. Great to see you both again. Thanks so much. Peter, to you first, if I may. Let's have a look at the Times, double-page spread, 4 and 5. Rebels took the city without a single shot being fired. Of course, that's Rostov-on-Don, which is the main operations hub for the war in Ukraine for Russia. And certainly it wasn't just that it was a peaceful takeover. They were actually welcomed by civilians, giving them high fives.
Yeah, I mean, it really was an extraordinary day. When I say that as someone who was actually in Moscow for the last coup in 1991, which was itself quite an extraordinary 3 days, I suppose. This one was all over in a day. So what happened? Essentially, forces loyal to Prigozhin, the mercenary head of the Wagner group, to them as far as we could see. They took over the military headquarters, and then from there they advanced up the main M4 highway towards Voronezh. As they went, there was more trouble along the way. There was some skirmishes, it seems, with Russian forces, but again, they appear to have taken control of some key places in Voronezh, and then continued upward on the road towards Moscow. And as we know, they turned back suddenly about 120 miles or so before they reached the capital.
And Samantha, let's have a look at the double-page spread also in the Times, page 6 and 7, which talks about Evgeny Prigozhin in detail. Of course, he's known Vladimir Putin for years. They first met in Leningrad, then St. Petersburg, and it talks about how he was a hot dog seller and now a warlord. This profile of him talks about the extraordinary story. I mean, he's a Kremlin creature, really, isn't he?
Also, he's a Kremlin creature. He's a creature of the criminal underworld, which is what Putin basically is as well. And that's what I think we always forget when we think about Putin, we think about the Russian government, is the extent to which crime and government are so closely linked in Russia today. So Evgeny Prigozhin was a lot more than a hot dog seller. I mean, he came out of prison, he began selling hot dogs, and all of a sudden he was caterer to the army and the Russian government. You can only do that if you have both criminal and political patronage. So this has really been a war between two mafia bosses that we've seen.
Yeah, and further to that, Peter, the double-page spread in The Sun talks about Vladimir Putin being bitten by his own mad dog, as their headline puts it. But certainly it's interesting, this intervention from Alexander Lukashenko, and we've also heard this morning that perhaps President Xi was also involved in yesterday's climb down.
Yeah, I mean, we still really don't know what all this is about. I mean, we had a day of extraordinary events, and then which concludes with something which no one was expecting. Suddenly, was flashing up on the news wires that Lukashenko had somehow brokered a deal. I mean, do we believe everything that was actually as it appears to have been? With Russia, you never know. But I think, everything is going to become a little bit clearer in the next few days, I think. And particularly whether Prigozhin actually goes to Belarus, because as far as I can see, we're not sure he's there yet, or indeed whether he will go. And, why does Lukashenko want this warlord living on his territory? It is all very, very strange indeed.
It is, isn't it? And certainly the headline in the Mail, given as the reason for this climb down in terms of the march on Moscow, was that Prigozhin didn't want to spill Russian blood. Samantha, it would have been quite something to have seen Russian on Russian fighting in Russia.
Well, we've seen this before. We saw this a few weeks ago when you had Russians who were fighting alongside the Ukrainians in Ukraine come in to the Belgorod region on the border with Ukraine and try and take over a few villages. So there was no blood spilled, but there was certainly confrontation. And yes, Russian on Russian blood would have been could have become very, very bloody, but it is a little bit extraordinary to have Yevgeny Prigozhin wondering, being concerned about spilling Russian blood when he has sent so many men to the meat grinder, particularly in Bakhmut. But he's talking to the Russian audience here, people who know what the bloodshed is in Ukraine, and he's the only one who's actually been talking about the true toll of this war. So there's again another very populist little note being struck there.
Fascinating double-page spread in The Observer, Peter. I'm taken by all of the headlines here. I hope he wins, is how one civilian gave their reaction in Rostov-on-Don yesterday when Wagner took control. And then another headline, Putin is now into the final act of his Macbeth-like presidency. And lastly, a bit more detail about how Russian state television covered these events yesterday. Apparently, the rebellion was aired briefly, and then they switched to a documentary on caviar.
Yes, I mean, I think of the three, probably the last is the most interesting, isn't it? Because you're the Russian, if one is the Russian media, how on earth do you cover something of this enormity that's going on in your country? I mean, they could have just ignored it, but these days they can't do that because of social media. And so, as far as one can see, they kind of were very, very cautious in what they reported. They reported that there was something was going on. They were very careful to follow the official line. Underlying it was a little bit of a kind of a calm, please be calm, don't panic message out to the population. And as the Observer points out, in between, people were treated to a documentary on caviar and also one on the life of Silvio Berlusconi, an old mate, old mucker of Putin's. The other stories, I think it's interesting. The Observer is focused on Rostov, what actually went on there. And, what's clear from the piece is that a number of local people did actually welcome the arrival of the Wagner forces. I think, one shouldn't forget that Prigozhin does have a degree of popularity. He's a kind of populist that appeals to a certain number of people. Others, I think, in the sort of typical kind of Russian way, were just sort of walking around rather bemused, taking everything in their stride, as they've had to do over the years.
And very briefly, Samantha, has this damaged Putin? Evgeny Prigozhin has a huge social media profile, so even if not covered on state media, they'll have seen on Telegram many of these things yesterday.
Yes, I think it has damaged Putin because Putin had to climb down from his initial statements in the morning. And how can one not be damaged when a 25,000 men army is able to get to the gates of Moscow? But Prigozhin, I think, has also come out damaged. What I've been seeing on a lot of social media channels are Wagner men absolutely furious, disillusioned, saying, we thought this man had our back and he's just dropped us and run away. So both men...
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. All the latest from Russia at the top of the hour.